So let's build a custom Drupal module. In our custom module, we are going to make data objects. We're going to make services. We're going to use dependency injection. We might even use decorators. I can't recall exactly. But if we don't use decorators in this module, then I will pull up some other example modules I have. We have plenty of examples to look at. So first things first, we are going to plan our module. This is going to be a cat API consumer module. Who would have thunk it? And the cat API that we're going to consume is this one here, where anyone can go get a free API key for and make use of. And what this module does is it retrieves data from the cat API, and it has a configuration form and some other things. So at this part of the presentation, I'm going to be showing a lot of slides where in the real world the code was much longer than the room I have for in slides. So just be aware that the code's going to look truncated, and at any point we can switch over to the GitHub repo, and later we can even just explore this module and some of the other examples as much as we want in PHP Storm. And I also have a running instance of a Drupal site that we can look at the results of these modules. I'll try to keep in mind uh, highlighting what to pay attention to that'll matter to the next slide before changing too fast. But also, if you have any questions, just throw it in the chat and I will try to get to it. All right, so here are the features of our cat API module. It's going to provide a custom service for consuming the cat API. It's going to provide a factory for creating our service so that we keep our dependencies well separated. It's going to have a configuration form so that we can put in our API keys and any other sort of configurable dependencies like that. We'll have a custom block type for displaying a random picture of cats. We'll have a couple custom routes where we can go look at cat pictures or browse through different cat types or even search the cat API. So this isn't all just for fun. All of these do just for reference, all of these will have some value in these will all build on something we've already talked about. Many of these examples will show how to do dependency injection in this scenario in Drupal 8. And we can see that it's going to be made up of parts of all things that we've talked about before. Everything that we're going to use to build this custom Drupal module, we've talked about before. So let's get started. First things first is we're going to have some configuration, and I didn't necessarily go through all of the settings forms and stuff here. So just a heads up, I'm not going to show the configuration form, but I did want you to know what we're dealing with in the rest of the code. This module does have some configuration, and those two configuration data points are the base URI for the API and the API key that we need to authenticate with the API. So this is set up in the module, this sort of the configuration schema, and the default values for our configuration is also already set up in the module. And the implication of what I'm showing here with the YAML is that we can go get the cat API settings from Drupal, or we can inject these into our code later by using the config system. And this one is going to be called the base URI, and this one's going to be called the API key. So this is just a heads up slide because we're going to be using these things. So first things first, we're going to have this cat API client, and we're going to be passing it around a bit. So we want to define an interface so that those bits that we're passing it around to can program to the interface. Well, our API client is going to be really simple. It's going to have one method, get. This should look very similar to what we've looked at before. So we define a new cat API client interface that demands one method exist that accepts two parameters, a string that's an endpoint and an array that's a query, and its return type will be an array of data, which is just cat data. So, and then we will implement this interface with our cat API client class. So our CAT API client class is going to expect a fully prepared and ready built HTTP client. It's going to expect the Drupal core JSON serializer service. This is because the the API returns JSON responses, and we want to go ahead and decode that for the people that use our service. And it does implement our get method, accepting an endpoint and a query array, and it will return a JSON decoded array. So this is the implementation of our interface as a class. Still no dependencies here. The next thing we're going to do is define a factory service. So this service is just here to create new instances of our API, of our CAT API client. We could have done this as a method factory instead of a factory service. Uh, I don't think there would be much difference in the two, but I just went with the factory service. So the CAT API client factory, it expects to be provided with 3 dependencies: Drupal's config factory, Drupal's HTTP client factory, or the thing that makes Guzzle clients for us, and Drupal's core JSON serialization service. And on the construction of this, it just saves all of those things right here to properties on our factory class. And it has a method called create, and running the create method will go get the CAT API settings from the configuration factory, and it will instantiate a new HTTP client. It will pass in our configured base URI to the client and our API key to the client. And then it will return a new fully built, decoupled from everything, from all of its dependencies instance of the CAT API client, completely ready to go. So we've written these 2 classes, and now let's just tie them into our Drupal module, Drupal. So let's add our CAT API services.yaml file. And the first thing first is we're going to add the client CAT API client factory as a service. And when we were writing this, we needed the config factory service, the HTTP client factory service, and the JSON serialization service. And so we tell the services file to pass these other services into ours as its constructor parameters, so that when the dependency injection container is building itself, it says like, or when the dependency injection is first requesting this, or being requested this client factory, it goes and gets the config factory and it passes it all in. It's all nice and neat. We didn't have to do any of the hooking things up together, or rather, this is how we did it. And also in our services file, we're going to add a client itself that's a fully built, ready to go client. And we're going to say that this client is an instance of this class, the CAT API client. And look at this, I can actually define in my services file that it should use a factory to create this for me. And the factory it's going to use is from another service. See the @ symbol there, the CAT API client factory, and it's going to run the method create. So that when someone creates some part of the system, requests the CAT API.client from the container or the service locator, if it doesn't exist, it'll be like, okay, I know how to build one of these. I'm going to run this services create method. And since the factory is creating the service fully prepared, I don't need to define any arguments here on the service definition, because the factory has handled all of that for me. All right. And so here's a complete version of our YAML file. When something or someone requests the client factory, the container is smart enough to provide it with its dependencies, inject its dependencies into its constructor. And when some other part of the system first requests the CAT API client, the the service locator or the dependency injection container is smart enough to say like, oh, I don't make a new one of these. I ask this factory to give me one of them. And that's how we've built the services for this module. And there are no dependencies defined inside of any of our classes. Does anybody have any question about that? And yeah, does anybody have any questions about so far our module? We've just written 2 classes that are services, and we've added them to the module service file. All right. So Drupal core also makes use of this factory concept, service factory concept in its core.services file. The Guzzle HTTP client itself is produced by the factory service, so that when you are requesting this HTTP client, if it's the first time it's being requested on the during the run of this page during the request, then Symfony's container will say like, oh, I know how to make one of those. I will ask the HTTP client factories from options method to give me one of these. And that's where it is. And if you look in the core.services file, which is extremely useful when developing in Drupal, because this is how you know what things are called. They don't tend to follow a pattern. The naming of services don't tend to follow an easily recognizable pattern. So if you're ever wondering what services are available in Drupal core, keep this open while building your custom modules. It's very helpful. So there are many more examples in Drupal core of factory services and then other services who are built from those factories. This is just a simple example. All right. So in Drupal, well, in Symfony, events are services. So if you haven't done much with events, then know that events are very similar to hooks, but it's object-oriented hooks. So an event is some custom code or some code that you've written that gets executed during a certain part of the page request, just like a hook. But in Symfony, services events are services rather than just Drupal hooks, which are function names we put in a .module file somewhere. So, and therefore, when we are defining our events, we put our event names into the services, into the services.yaml file. We put our events in the services.yaml file. I'm missing one part of this definition here where we have to actually tag this. I could probably pull that up, but there's a little bit missing here. Let me pull that up just for the sake of posterity. One moment. Okay, there we go. All right, so this is a fully written event subscriber in a module. So our events are defined as services, and they point to classes. These classes are what respond to the events. These classes are the subscribers to events. And since they're defined as a service, we can actually just pass in dependencies for our event into as arguments into our event class directly. So because the container is going to look at arguments before it makes our event class, it's going to say like, oh, this event wants a copy of the config factory and it wants a copy of the entity type manager. And so when we write our custom event subscriber in a module, the way that we do dependency injection is the way that we do dependency injection for every other service. You define the arguments in your event details here, and then the constructor for your event class will expect those parameters to be passed in. So this is dependency injection with events in Drupal. And it's very simple because events are services. There's really nothing new here at all. Next up, let's see. Next up, more dependency injection. So dependency injection in Drupalisms, these are all the sort of Drupal specific implementations of the different parts of the Drupal 8 or Drupal 9 specific implementations that we as developers deal with all the time, like custom forms, custom plugins, or like a block type, custom controllers and stuff. So since these things aren't registered as services in our module, we have to find another way to do dependency injection with these Drupalisms, because the services, the dependency injection container isn't. Let me rephrase. Since they're not services, we don't have anywhere to tell it what the dependencies are. We have no part of the instantiation process. So we have to use a different approach for each of these. So let's start with the easiest, which is actually, let's start with the concept. So luckily there is a concept that solves this for us. There's an interface that's available as a part of the Symfony dependency injection component called Container Injection Interface. And what this interface says is that any class implementing this interface must define a method factory named create. So this is a public static function named create that expects it demands the parameter of a container. So this is our service locator, or I'm going to just keep calling it container because the way we're using it is a container. So what we can do is we can take other parts of our system where the classes are instantiated by Drupal, and we can say that, oh, our classes implement these interfaces, and what that does is that forces us to define this method factory, and our class itself can sort of control how it is being constructed. So this is basically going to solve two of our Drupalism dependency injection problems for us. Let's look at the first one, which is controllers, which are pretty straightforward. So a controller in Drupal is the thing that handles a route. So it's a class that handles a route. This is a very rough example, a very short example of a controller, but we have a YAML file called routing.yaml in Drupal. And I've said that this route has the path of browse cats, and the class or the action, I keep mixing the words, the method that will control how this page works is the method on the browse cats page class called page. Okay, so let me try to restate that because that was really jumbled. So I've defined a new route at browse cats, and this new class I wrote called browse cats page is going to handle that route. It's going to deal with requests that are sent to that URL. So what I do is I write my class and I say that my class implements the container injection interface, which means it has a static public function on it called create. It has a method factory, and this create method accepts the entire container. So the implementation of this method is to return a new instance of itself, this class, a new instance of browse cats page, and pass in as the first parameter of the constructor a service from the container called the cat API client. So by implementing this interface, Drupal, when handling this route, Drupal says like, okay, so I know what class I need to instantiate. It's browse cats page. Is this class a container injection interface? Oh, it is. Then I'm gonna instantiate that class by running the create method. And therefore, Drupal has detected that we are of the data type container injection interface, and that means this method must exist, and this method is what will create the instance of our browse cats page class. And therefore, now we can control the construction of our controller classes. Any questions about this so far? We're still just now we're using the ideas we've built on. We're using interfaces. Yes.
Yeah, so I don't get how the colon page and the function create are linked.
Sure. So the colon. So when you are running a method on a class in PHP that is static, so I'm going to take a step back. Whenever something's static in PHP, that means it's been loaded into memory before runtime. So PHP knows that this method exists before a browse cats page class is ever instantiated. What that means is that somewhere in memory, PHP is storing the information that browse cats page create exist. And the syntax for accessing the syntax in PHP for accessing static methods on a class is colon colon. It's that simple. This is a syntax thing. This means, sorry, this is a missing a part of the example. Let me clear this up one other way. So one second. We're going to go into controllers. I'm going to do
I guess I was just expecting that to be colon create, but that's not.
no. So that is what's confused. I totally understand the confusion.
Oh, I didn't see
So
that bottom line.
I just added it
Oh, okay.
because it was super confusing without it. So what Drupal, thank you for bringing that up. So what Drupal is doing is going to say anybody that hits this URL gets served the results of the page method on browse cats page. So the order of operation though is that someone goes and visits this URL browse cats page, and Drupal says like, do I have that controller constructed yet? Oh, I don't. So I need, first things first is I need a copy of the browse cats page controller. I need to instantiate that. Well, let me look at it. Okay. Does it implement the container injection interface? Oh, it does. Great. I will run that. So we're not at page yet. We're not here yet. So Drupal says, all right, this thing expects the container to be created through this static, this method factory called create. And so I will instantiate this browse cats page object using that. It runs this create method. And then it says, okay, now I have an instance of this class browse cats page that I can send the visitor to. So then it runs colon page. It's I understand the confusion here and I apologize, but this colon page doesn't have anything to do with the creation of the class itself. It's the part of the class that Drupal will send this URL to. And it might be good to look at this more in like an actual code editor where I have more to see here. There definitely was sort of a limitation, but I think the point of this slide is that if we implement this interface on our controllers, then we can, if we implement this interface, then we're saying that our class has a method factory called create. And then we can control the instantiation of our class and we can inject the dependencies in it. The colon page part is super confusing. Sorry. Great question though, because I need to come up with a better way to explain that. We'll work on that later. Any other questions about this? About the container injection interface or the method factory that we add. So this is all really still a part of Symfony, by the way. Uh, Drupal, this interface is coming from Symfony. The routing is coming from Symfony wrapped in some Drupal stuff. And we are just doing Symfony inside of Drupal. All right, I'm going to go on. All right. Sorry, I had to restart that every time I edit my slides. Okay, so let's do dependency injection inside of a form. So it is exactly like dependency injection in a controller. We need to implement the container injection interface. But in the case of forms, custom forms, that interface is already implemented for us. So if we define a new form in our module called search catch form, and we extend form base, well, form base already implements container injection interface. So we don't have to add implements container injection interface to our code. We could, but I don't think we don't have to. But it works exactly, the application or the use of that interface works exactly like we just saw with the controller. So we have written a custom form. We extend the form base like you do with a custom form, and therefore we already have access. We have already implemented that container injection interface. And so all we need to do is supply the method factory that determines how our form is constructed. So in this case, we are going to search the CATS API. So I want to make sure that this form already has the CAT API client available to it when it's loaded. And so I will tell so I expect that to be passed in because we're separating out our dependencies from our classes. And so I will make use of this container injection interface by defining the public static function create. And I'll say, when creating this search catch form, the container should pass in my CAT API client service into this form. So it's exactly the same in that the way that we get access to the container to use dependency injection in controllers and forms is to implement that container injection interface. And just to reiterate, by having a method factory on our class, we haven't coupled our class to the container at all. This class could still be instantiated without running create. You could always just run new search cats form and pass in whatever you need. That's why that is why we're not coupled to the container. All right, and a slightly more complicated but very similar version of this is with plugins. So in the case of plugins already have a complicated, or they already have a constructor that requires a certain number of parameters, 3 parameters in a specific order. And so when we want to deal with when we want to do dependency injections inside of plugins, and just for reference, an example of a plugin is a custom block type or a custom field formatter, something like that. Rather than the container injection interface, what we're going to do is we're going to use the Drupal provided container factory plugin interface. This interface defines that our classes that implement it must have a static public function named create. Very, very similar. And that method factory is going to expect the container object, which we're very comfortable with by now. And also the parts of the normal parts of the plugin constructor, the plugin's configuration and its ID and its definition. So this would be like the block ID and all the block settings and stuff like that. The only thing that's a little trickier is just that you have to account for in your method factory, you have to make sure to pass all of these into the constructor as well. So let's look at an example of this with a custom block. So I've made a custom block type called cat API random cat. It just shows a picture of a random cat. And I want to inject my cat API client into this custom block type just to keep things nice and clean. So what I have to do, or I've got to do a couple of things here. First, let's start from the responsibility of this cat API random cat class. So I have to define a new constructor on this, and I know that I have to expect the parameters of the normal plugin, the normal block parameters, the parent, the block base. So the configuration array, the plugin ID, the plugin definition. Oh, and I see that I didn't match all these up well. But also I want my cat API client to come into this, to come into the constructor so that this, as a dependency is injected. What I do is I define the constructor and make sure that I can accept the three normal things: plugin ID, plugin definition, and also my new dependencies that I want to define as a part of my block. And I pass in the three original things to the parent's constructor. So I take the configuration, the ID, the definition, I'm passing into the parent constructor so that this block gets fully built as defined by the block base. And also anything else I wanted from the container, I got, and I just go ahead and assign as a property onto this class. So in the implementation of our method factory, we get the container first, and then we get the normal block stuff, and then we just pass it into our custom constructor however we want. The main thing, we can pass these in any order because our constructor can expect parameters in any order. The main thing to note is that we need to pass along to the parent constructor its expectations, its dependencies. So if you have a block that actually has multiple service dependencies, you could just keep extending your own constructor to expect more and more. And all you need to do is just make sure you keep passing in services from the container here in your method factory. But ultimately, it's still the same. It's still making a method factory named create on your classes. That's how all of these things work. The signature is just slightly different for plugins. All right. So the takeaway for dependency injection in Drupal is that there is a way to do that. For any part of Drupal, whether it be like a not even Drupal, like a services, it's really just a part of Symfony, or a Drupalism like a custom form or a plugin or something like that, there is some way to do dependency injection. If you're, I'm struggling to think of another part of the system off the top of my head that's not represented by either a service or a plugin or a form or a controller. But if you run into another part of the system that's not one of these things, and it doesn't have a clear point of instantiation, I would guess, I hope, and I would guess that there is some way to make a factory for your work there and pass in its dependencies from the container. Ideally, we're never calling Drupal : service or Drupal : database. And we've separated our dependencies from outside of our custom classes. All right, any questions? Right at 3 hours.